This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Mutelli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Typhoon Dolphin pounds eastern China, triggering floods, evacuations and travel chaos. It's also fueling Hong Kong's heat wave, putting the city's heat warning system under fresh scrutiny. Recovery efforts ramping up in quake-hit Kumamoto. More than 1,000 volunteers have poured in to help as the U.S. military in Japan delivers much-needed aid. Now, the U.S. and South Korea to begin major military drills next Monday. The 11-day exercise drawing lessons from recent conflicts and coming after Pyongyang's latest ballistic missile launch. A Chinese state media says that Pacific nations are pushing back against Australia and New Zealand and refusing to take sides after failing to agree on a joint statement over Beijing's recent missile test.
South China Sea is a critical maritime domain in which the global economy depends on, not just Southeast Asia, but U.S. allies in Northeast Asia, the United States, our trade agenda.
U.S. Ambassador to ASEAN, Kevin Kim, speaks exclusively to CNA, offering insight into the Trump administration's priorities for the region. Plus, weaving for the future. This workshop is building livelihoods while keeping a centuries-old Tibetan craft alive, one thread at a time. Parts of eastern China hit with heavy flooding as Typhoon Dolphin barrels further inland, following its landfall in Zhejiang province yesterday. Now, the weather agency downgraded its typhoon alert to the lowest level this morning as the storm weakens. Officials, however, warn that parts of eastern and central China could still see heavy downpours as they issued the highest level flash flood alert for parts of eastern and southern Zhejiang. Well, northern China is also bracing for the effects of Typhoon Dolphin. Authorities in the capital, Beijing, have issued warnings for torrential rain over the next 3 days, with alerts for landslides and flooding. Well, the storm also triggering blistering heat in Hong Kong, with record temperatures recorded in parts of the city yesterday, with high heat expected to remain until midweek. Now, for more, we are joined now by CNA correspondents Crystal Chia in Shanghai and Geraldine Yap in Hong Kong. Well, Crystal, going to start things with you first. Tell us, what is the latest situation in China now in the aftermath of the storm?
So this is China's most powerful typhoon this year, with winds of about 150 kilometers an hour at the typhoon's center during landfall. Now, officials have not yet released any official statistics. They say that numbers on potential deaths, property losses or missing persons will only be released later, and cautioned against believing some of those unverified social media posts. Now, in Shanghai, we are expecting rain for about the next week or so, but daily life is still continuing as per usual. I was still able to get a cab this morning. Food delivery is operating, and at Shanghai's airports, even though 60% of flights have been cancelled previously, they are starting to restart from midday today. The situation further south, however, is much more severe. In eastern Zhejiang province, that's where Typhoon Dolphin landed, there were waves of about 6 meters eroding seawalls. And in Taizhou, we saw streets turn into very fast-flowing rivers. Trees are toppling onto the roadsides, and some coastal towns have faced power outages. Now, looking ahead, the focus has already turned to recovery efforts for some places. Officials are prioritizing draining areas that are near essential buildings, such as hospitals. Major roads are also progressively being reopened. But authorities continue to urge residents to stay vigilant, especially as Typhoon Dolphin is expected to bring heavy rain to many parts of China.
All right, Crystal, Geraldine, let's bring you into the conversation now. As the typhoon continues to move across China, let's talk about the heat levels in Hong Kong. How is it being impacted?
Well, the heat here in Hong Kong has subsided quite a bit today, because there has been a bit of breeze as well, so it has helped things. But the temperature has stayed above 32 degrees across the city for most of today. We're here at the waterfront and we do see that tourists are still out and about taking photos. The locals have come out for an evening run as well, but I did see that, there was a long line nearby at the ice cream truck by the waterfront area. Now, we have seen a lot of people going around with portable fans and umbrellas to try and stay cool in this extreme heat. But, some people I spoke to, they said that they are starting to feel physically the effects of the extreme weather. For example, they were getting headaches. And, we have seen reports over the weekend also saying that some people had been airlifted to the hospital after they fell ill in the heat, while they were hiking. Just to give you an idea of how hot it has been in Hong Kong, the 36.9 degrees Celsius reading that was taken yesterday was actually the highest temperature that was ever recorded since records started in the city over 140 years ago. And that's not even the highest reading that was taken in the city. In one of the weather stations in the northern part of Hong Kong, a reading of 39.8 degrees was taken as well. The Hong Kong weather forecaster says that this heat is expected to persist. We can expect to see temperatures of up to 37 degrees at some areas in the city over the next few days. And this is because of the outer subsiding airflow brought about by Typhoon Dolphin. So we are expecting thundery showers in the later half of this week, and that's expected to bring some relief from the heat.
And Jerry, as you've mentioned, right now the heat has somewhat subsided, but nevertheless there's been criticism and concerns on Hong Kong's heat stress warning system, hasn't there?
Yes, so with the temperatures hitting record highs, record levels yesterday, the heat stress warning level had actually stayed at the lowest amber level, and that raised a lot of questions about how the system works. Now, for context, when the alert level is raised to either red or black, this means, according to the guidelines, that workers with either heavy or very heavy workloads should actually suspend their duties. But, this alert level was not raised from yellow for the whole of yesterday, despite the fact that temperatures had reached almost 40 degrees at certain sites. And so the industry representatives from construction industry, for example, were saying that the requirements to raise the alert level actually, they feel, is too rigid. Now, in response, the Hong Kong government said that, when looking at heat stress, the temperature is just one of the risk factors that they look at. Other things that they look at include humidity and wind conditions. And because these conditions were considered favorable yesterday, that's why the heat stress level, alert level, wasn't raised any further. But the government said that they will continue to monitor the hot weather situation and also review and look at whether this heat stress alert level system needs to be further optimized.
Right, and Crystal, this Typhoon Dolphin, it's being called the strongest storm to hit China this year. Tell us more about that.
Now, I'll tell you, this is typhoon season in China, and in August, we often see about 2 to 3 typhoons. But Typhoon Dolphin is different. First, its location. It was formed near the international date line. It has traveled thousands of kilometers over more than 10 days. This makes it China's easternmost origin typhoon since records began in 1951. Now, secondly, despite having traveled for so long and so far, it has arrived as a large-sized system. It landed in eastern Zhejiang province yesterday, and now it is moving inland, bringing rain to more than 10 provinces. Even places like Beijing, which is in the north, they are also expected to see some impact. Now, Typhoon Dolphin and its impact is just the latest in China's string of extreme weather events. And Chinese authorities have warned that more might be coming. They say that the developing El Nino phenomenon is highly unusual. Coinciding with global warming, this means that China, together with the rest of the world, will have to brace for more unforeseen and extreme weather patterns going forward. Oteli?
Many thanks for those updates. CNA correspondent Crystal Chia in wet and rainy Shanghai. We've got Geraldine Yap in scorching hot Hong Kong. Thanks very much, ladies. Well, meantime, Tropical Storm Chanhom is forecast to affect Japan tomorrow. Well, the Met Agency says that the storm is tracking westwards and could bring about strong winds and rains to part of the Honshu region. It has called for vigilance, warning of possible landslides and flooding in low-lying areas. High temperatures brought about by the combined effects of both Dolphin and Chanhom will continue to affect parts of Japan. Some southern and central cities are experiencing temperatures of up to 36 degrees Celsius today. Heat stroke alerts have been issued for 7 of Japan's 47 prefectures. And that heat is adding to the challenges in quake-hit Kumamoto, where communities are still struggling with the fallout from last month's powerful earthquake. The economic toll itself is already mounting. Some 65,000 hotel bookings have reportedly been cancelled, costing the tourism industry around $5.7 million. Transport disruptions and fears of aftershocks are also keeping visitors away across southwestern Kyushu. But the recovery effort is gathering pace. More than 1,200 volunteers have poured into Kumamoto to help communities get back on their feet. In Yuki, one of the hardest hit areas, more than 100 people queued for assignments, with up to 200 volunteers signing up each day. Centres have been set up across nearly a dozen municipalities, and in many places, volunteers are turning up in greater numbers than requested. Help is coming from abroad as well. U.S. forces airlifted some 33,000 bottles of drinking water into Kumamoto on Sunday, but the scale of the disaster remains stark. 38 people lost their lives, with more than 100 others injured. And the damage extensive. Hundreds of homes were destroyed, with thousands more buildings affected. Well, time now for a short break, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, Sony and TSMC reportedly planning a joint venture to make next-generation microchips for image sensors. Plus, South Korea steps up its semiconductor ambitions. President Lee Jae-myung calls for faster action on a major new chip hub as Seoul races to stay competitive in the global semiconductor battle. Hello again. Good to have your company on East Asia tonight. We've got Roland Lim here standing by with the very latest in business news. And Roland, I want to ask you about Taiwan's equity benchmark. Apparently that jumped to its highest in about 3 weeks. Tell us more about what led to those gains.
That's all thanks to chipmaker TSMC climbing higher today. Now, as the world's most valuable contract chipmaker, its weighting is over 40% of the total market capitalization of the Taiwan Weighted Index. The company reporting another surge in sales as demand for artificial intelligence hardware remains strong. Revenue jumped 45% in July from a year earlier, reaching $14.5 billion. Remember, TSMC is a key supplier to NVIDIA and Apple. It also raised its outlook for the year as it expects the AI boom to extend into 2027 and beyond. The chipmaker now plans to record capital spending of between $60 and $64 billion this year, while forecasting annual sales growth of over 40%. That confidence comes despite concerns over lofty tech valuations and whether massive AI investments will ultimately pay off. TSMC shares have slipped about 5% from their June peak, but are still up more than 50% this year. Staying on TSMC, Sony Group and the chipmaker are reportedly in talks to spend a combined $6.4 billion on their planned image sensor factory in Japan. The two firms are eyeing demand for physical AI, including in robotics and automotive industries, which are expected to require next-generation microchips used in image sensors. Reports say they are seeking a joint venture owned about 60% by Sony's chip-making arm, Sony Semiconductor Solutions Corp, and 40% TSMC. Commercial production are also set to start in 2029, however. An official timeline for the investments yet to be given. The tech giants had announced plans for the joint venture in Japan back in May, leveraging on TSMC's manufacturing and process technology with Sony's sensor design expertise. The Japanese company's shares rose as much as 2.2%, while TSMC gained 1.7% on Monday. Analysts say the joint venture lowers Sony's capital burden to expand its image sensor investment while securing steady revenue for TSMC. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung is calling for a military base to make way for a major semiconductor hub within the next 2 years, underscoring Seoul's push to strengthen a key pillar of its economy.
광주 군공항 부지를 반도체 클러스터로 지정하기로 했습니다. 그리고 국방부는 28년 중순까지 광주 기지 기능을 다른 군공항으로 임시 배치해서 광주 군공항 부지가 반도체 산업단지로 조기에 활용될 수 있도록 조치해 주면 좋겠습니다.
His administration unveiled plans worth more than $500 billion in June to accelerate the development of a semiconductor production hub in Gwangju, in the country's southwest. Mr. Lee pointed to the speed of construction of Japan's semiconductor hub in Kumamoto, where TSMC took less than 2 years to build its plant. Calling 2027 the project's golden time, Mr. Lee urged officials to move beyond a so-called speed war to get operations running and to engage in what he calls a decisive battle. Now, South Korea and Taiwan have reportedly overtaken Japan in total exports for the first time for the first half of this year, in booming AI demand reshaping Asia's export landscape. According to a Nikkei analysis, Japan's exports from January to June reached $384 billion, compared with nearly $500 billion for South Korea and $417 billion for Taiwan. Still, Japan's exports grew nearly 10% on year, but South Korea and Taiwan each posted gains of almost 50%. Analysts say Japan remains strong in upstream areas, that's including semiconductor manufacturing equipment and chip design. But those shipments are less likely to see the same level of demand as finished products fueled by the AI boom. Details from the latest Bank of Japan meeting show that policymakers warned of mounting inflation risks that could require a faster than expected pace of rate hikes. Now, many back the case for watching inflation risks closely due to rising import costs from a weak yen. A strong AI demand also added to higher fuel costs. BOJ Governor Kazuo Ueda's comments after July's meeting were interpreted as signaling for a strong chance of a rate hike as soon as September. Attention is on the yen today after it strengthened following weak U.S. jobs report that dampened expectations for a rate hike from the Federal Reserve. The yen has given back some of its gains from the U.S.-Japan joint intervention, but the currency remains well above the multi-decade low it hit late last month. The Nikkei 225 is gaining, supported by AI and chip-linked stocks after similar gains on Wall Street at the end of last week. But gains are also being capped by the Middle East conflict. Unease over the yen is growing among Japanese firms, with executives warning that both a weak currency and sharp exchange rate swings pose risks to the economy. Japan's External Trade Organization says a weaker yen can make local products more competitive overseas, but also raises the cost of imported raw materials, eroding some of the benefits for exporters. Now, Uniqlo's parent company, Fast Retailing, and Ryohin Keikaku, which operates the Muji chain, announced measures last month to protect profit margins against the declining yen. The impact could spread further, with Japanese firms importing almost all of their raw materials. Executives are also calling for greater currency stability, saying that it was more important than having a stronger yen. Now, volatile exchange rates can disrupt earnings forecasts and make investment decisions harder for firms with global operations. A Chinese robot maker Unitree is taking a big step towards public listing. It has opened subscriptions for its Shanghai IPO and is widely expected to list next week. The offering could raise more than $900 million, valuing Unitree at around $9 billion. The money will be used to develop robot software and hardware, launch new products, and build a new manufacturing base. The listing comes as embodied AI, or AI integrated into physical systems, emerges as an increasingly important front in the global race for AI leadership. Remember, the US last month issued a sweeping ban on foreign imports of advanced robots. It cited national security risks. China accused Washington of overstretching the concept of national security and took retaliatory steps. Remember, the US accounted for more than 13% of Unitree's revenue last year. Unitree is one of China's leading humanoid robotic makers. Earlier this year, a robot dog that was presented at an AI summit in India as a locally developed machine. But social media users quickly identified it as a Unitree product, prompting criticisms and a correction from the university involved. Kingsley Jones of Jevons Global explained why he thinks Unitree's $9 billion valuation is justified, given the current stage of the humanoid robotics industry.
The comparison that I would make is with the huge valuations ascribed to, the software AI companies, the ones focused on chatbots and LLMs, so-called. And you can think of that as services automation. And it's understandable that in an economy like the United States, where it's dominated by services, that would be the focus. China's different. China doesn't have such a big, shall we say, middleman sector. So in terms of their services economy, it's a little compressed because there's less of that value add focus in China. There's much more on manufacturing, and I think that robotics is really having a profound effect on Chinese productivity through manufacturing. And this is maybe why you're seeing reduced price pressures. And indeed, I do think it is the objective of the Chinese government to improve the quality of growth that way. Jury's out as to whether this will help consumption activity in China, but I definitely think that the robotics valuation for Unitree is justified given the stage of business it's at, and the disparity between the valuation of, shall we say, embodied AI in robots and software AI.
Chinese AI chip maker Threads could set to become the next company to list from the region, to list in Hong Kong. This after its board approved plans to issue H shares on the HKEX main bourse. The Beijing-based firm said it plans to list there at an appropriate time after seeing its shares surge more than 422% since its Shanghai debut in December of last year. The move was announced after the company reported a 147% jump in first-half revenue as Threads seeks fresh capital amid booming demand for homegrown computing power. China markets are starting the week on a positive note. Investors also reacting to the latest inflation printout yesterday, which showed that price pressures cooling more than expected in July. China's producer price inflation eased more than expected to its weakest in 3 months. Consumer inflation remained under pressure. Now, analysts point to lower oil prices and weakening demand at home. They also describe China's economy as being in 2 speeds, with strong factory output and exports, but with weak domestic demand. And that is the latest at this hour for business.
Well, thanks so much for that report, Roland, and also for attempting to coordinate our outfits into Singapore's National Day. Really appreciate that. Well, on that note, we're going to go for another break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, how Chinese state-run media are seizing on an apparent diplomatic split after Pacific Island nations failed to reach a consensus condemning China's recent missile test. An expert joins us to discuss Beijing's clout over the region. You're watching East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Parts of eastern China inundated as Typhoon Dolphin brings heavy rains to the region as it barrels further inland. While recovery efforts gathering pace in Japan's quake-hit Kumamoto as volunteers turn up in greater numbers than requested and foreign aid pouring in. Plus, US and South Korea seek to boost military readiness against North Korea in their annual joint drills that will begin next week. A diplomatic split in the Pacific and Chinese media seizing on it. Last week, Pacific Island nations failed to agree on a joint statement condemning China's recent test of a nuclear-capable missile in the region. Now, Chinese state-run media are portraying that failure as a sign that Pacific nations are pushing back against their traditional allies, Australia and New Zealand, and refusing to be drawn into a wider strategic contest with Beijing. Now, the missile was test-fired into the Pacific last month, with its dummy warhead believed to have landed in waters somewhere between Solomon Islands, Nauru and Tuvalu. New Zealand had pushed for foreign ministers at the Pacific Islands Forum to issue a collective condemnation. But the members could not reach consensus after Kiribati and Nauru reportedly blocked the statement. Well, New Zealand Foreign Minister Winston Peters accused unnamed countries of putting the wishes of outside partners ahead of the interests of the Pacific. Chinese state-run media have hit back at that argument. The Global Times citing Chinese analysts describing the outcome as a rebuke to Canberra and Wellington, arguing that Pacific states increasingly want to decide for themselves who constitutes a friendly or a security threat. And the China Daily went further, accusing Australia and New Zealand of approaching the region with what it called a Cold War compass. Both push a similar message. The Pacific nations are asserting greater strategic autonomy and do not want to choose between China and the West. Well, for more analysis, let's bring in William Elberg, Senior Adjunct Fellow at the Pacific Forum. Well, thanks very much, William, for joining us this evening. Perhaps let's just start with the wider picture first about, Pacific foreign ministers not being able to agree on that joint statement condemning the missile test. In a nutshell, what does it tell us about the shifting diplomatic and security landscape as we see more powers competing for influence in the Pacific?
Right, the huge economic benefits of the Pacific region, the huge fisheries, the emerging competition for minerals on the seabed really have put the Pacific Islands Forum in the crosshairs of great power competition as the US and China both seek to influence the organization from the outside, to follow their interests, while the countries on the inside, like Australia and New Zealand, trying to get the Pacific Islands Forum to line up sort of with an anti-China point of view. It's a very big area of competition between these great powers, and Pacific Island Forums themselves, the islands within the region, have received a lot of funding from China, Australia, the United States, trying to sway them in different ways. In a way, I would be surprised if they had all agreed to condemn China's vote, because China has worked so hard to provide funding and other cooperation in the region to split them away from the United States and Australia.
Well, when we hear Chinese state media pushing that similar message about how Pacific nations are asserting, strategic autonomy, they don't want to choose, between the China and the West. What's your assessment of that argument?
I think there is. I think there is some merit to that argument, because China has, as I mentioned, invested money in trying to split off individual Pacific Islands from the group to vote with their interests, both in the Pacific Island Forum and the United Nations and other areas. And I think some countries within the region have felt that pressure a little bit too keenly. You look at the Solomon Islands, where Prime Minister Wale has really sort of pushed back against the agreement that they signed with China in 2022, is trying to move back closer to Australia and the United States. I think some of the countries in the region are feeling the costs of Chinese cooperation and are trying to figure out exactly what to do. But really, this is kind of an unprecedented level of competition for the interest of these countries in the region. And some countries, really are wondering what the price that they should allow these other countries to pay in order to get their attention, in order to keep their votes. So on the one hand, I think China is right. They have had huge influence in the region. But on the other hand, I think that may have peaked. And now we see a push back against Chinese overextension of influence, and Australia really trying to move in and fill in some of those gaps.
Now, if we look at what Beijing may have been trying to signal here, well, CNA, we spoke to an expert from the Lowy Institute who says that he sees the test as a deterrence message aimed primarily at the US and to Russia to a certain extent. He also says that we should be expecting more of such tests as China expands its capabilities. Again, do you share that assessment?
To a certain degree, yes. So China last year launched an ICBM into the same region, so a land-launched missile into the same region. And now this year we see a sub-launched ballistic missile. Before that, you have to go back to 1980 for the last test that China fired over the Pacific. In part, this is because China has been a little bit concerned about the quality of their missiles. And now they have far more confidence that these missiles are effective, and they need to demonstrate the ability of these missiles to reach really, really long-range targets in order to deter Russia and the United States. So in a way, it is a deterrence message, but it's also, a message internally that their systems are working, that they have a complete deterrent with air, land, and sea launch capabilities. So it is a message, but it's also a message to the region that China is here to stay, that China has the power projection capabilities across the entire region. So I think that's why you see countries like Australia and the Solomon Islands feeling a little bit more of a chill coming from Beijing because of this test.
All right, if I drill further down on the test itself, well, Beijing says that it did give advance notice, was being transparent about it. But what does responsible notification for a test like this actually look like? I mean, did China meet that standard?
Not at all. No, they did not. There is a global standard that is recognized by almost all the countries in the world. It's called the Hague Code of Conduct. 154 countries are signatory to it, and it requires at least a 24-hour notification prior to the launch of a missile. It requires you saying where it's launched from, where it's going to, whether it's a space launch or a ballistic missile launch. And in this case, China didn't do that. They told Japan, I think it was an hour before the launch, that they were going to do this. And there's some countries in the Pacific region that were not notified at all. The Hague Code of Conduct would have required China to inform every other signatory to the Hague Code of Conduct, which would have included all of the nations in the region. But China refuses to sign this because they still like opacity. They still like a lack of transparency in order to deter other countries and make people uncertain about their means. So this sort of ad hoc notification that they did is not at all adequate. China should sign the Hague Code of Conduct and provide a very predictable and mandatory notification anytime it's going to fire a missile over this area. The US, for instance, tests into the Pacific, but they are a member of the Hague Code of Conduct. They always notify. Even Russia is a member of the Hague Code of Conduct and notifies their ballistic missile launches. And with China, as your colleague from the Lowy Institute said, China's going to be firing probably more and more missiles into the region over time. And I think the nations in the region have to demand that China join this international standard and provide a mandatory notification long before any missile launch happens, rather than doing this as sort of an ad hoc surprise.
Right. William, just very quickly, let's do a look ahead here. We've got the Pacific Islands Forum Leaders meeting in Palau that's happening from August 30th. If these divisions persist, I mean, what's at stake for the forum's unity and also its ability to speak collectively on regional security?
On the one hand, I think expectations are relatively low. But on the other hand, I am excited. Prime Minister Wale's from the Solomon Islands proposal for a regional defense pact or regional security concept is really interesting. One of the core issues is how do you maintain consensus and non-interference while at the same time improving consultation? Some countries in the region will see consultation, the requirement to talk about what agreements they're getting into with countries outside the region as an imposition on their, the core idea of non-interference. So are they going to move more towards, a European security idea where the countries of the region talk to each other before they sign agreements? Are they going to share security concerns and try to develop common approaches? Or are they going to continue on the non-interference model, which is more like the ASEAN states, and have very diverging views towards the United States, China, and the future of regional security in the region? So I think this forum will be incredibly important in terms of the discussion on this agreement. Does it come to something? Or do we continue to see divisions in threat perceptions and approaches towards security govern the Pacific Islands as we move forward?
Well, plenty to watch as we head towards that leaders meeting in Palau. Thanks so very much for your insights, William Elberg, Senior Adjunct Fellow at the Pacific Forum. Well, in other news, the US and South Korea say they are looking to boost military readiness against North Korea ahead of their annual joint military drills. The exercises follow Pyongyang's latest ballistic missile test on 6th of August. Ulchi Freedom Shield begins next Monday. It will last for nearly 2 weeks and involve about 18,000 soldiers. A U.S. military spokesperson says that realistic threats will feature in this year's drills, including lessons learned from recent conflicts.
Character of warfare has been changing. So even involving aspects of warfare, including drones, GPS disruption, and cyber attacks, are expected to be reflected in the exercise. Space Forces Korea is participating. They'll be a key player for U.S. Forces Korea. What I will also say is DPRK soldiers have deployed and fought in Ukraine, and they've taken those lessons they learned there and brought them back to North Korea. That changes the DPR capability, and our training accounts for that threat.
The drills next week is one of 2 main annual joint exercises between the U.S. and South Korea. Pyongyang regularly denounced the drills as provocations and rehearsals for invasion. But the U.S. and Seoul say that their combined exercises are defensive in nature. Well, wars in the Middle East and Ukraine are reshaping military priorities. Drones, electronic warfare, AI, and resilient supply chains are now at the center of defense planning. And NATO allies have also agreed to significantly raise defense spending, underscoring the growing focus on military readiness and modernization. Well, defense companies are adapting accordingly.
It's an evolving industry, and it's not just about a new generation of military hardware and software. Defense firms are now also focused on helping countries build and sustain critical capabilities closer to home, reducing dependence on foreign suppliers while strengthening domestic defense industries.
You've got basically an awareness of, if anything, an increased threat from certain other peer adversaries around the world, Russia, China. You've got the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, particularly the U.S.-Israel war with Iran. On top of that, you've got a growing awareness in Europe and other places that they've got to provide for their own defense capabilities, a higher level of defense sovereignty. And that, of course, takes additional resources to recreate capabilities that used to be shared between the U.S. and NATO, for example.
For governments, defense sovereignty is about more than buying new equipment. It means having greater control over how critical technologies are developed, maintained, and deployed, while building resilient supply chains and domestic industrial capabilities. That's creating new opportunities for collaboration among governments, local industry, and global defense manufacturers.
In order to have prosperity as a nation, you also need to have security as a nation. And so we've seen through the threats in Ukraine and other threats around the world and conflicts that nations need to ensure they protect their citizens and provide viable capabilities to do that. It's a really important conversation that's happening. We've had great dialogues.
While new defense technologies vary, one trend is clear. Autonomous systems are becoming central to military planning. Increasingly, aircraft are being designed to operate as teammates, supporting crewed platforms with greater endurance and ability to take on higher-risk missions. Boeing's MQ-28 Ghostbat is one of the highest-profile examples. Developed with the Royal Australian Air Force, it's designed to operate alongside crewed fighter jets as a collaborative combat aircraft. With defense spending on the rise, manufacturers are seeing growing demand. But governments will ultimately judge companies not just on innovation, but on whether they can deliver new capabilities on time and at scale.
Honestly, at the end of the day, we're committed to understanding what capabilities we can bring to bear to solve our customers' challenges. But at the same time, we're equally focused on ensuring that whatever we sign up to with our customers, we can deliver.
As governments invest more in defense, the challenge for industry is no longer just developing the next generation of military technology, but delivering it where and when it's needed.
Well, time now for another break, but coming up on East Asia tonight, CNA sits down with the U.S. ambassador to ASEAN in an exclusive interview. Get insights on Washington's approach to trade and the South China Sea. And the South Korean president's approval dropped to a record low since taking office. What's behind the decline? Trade, international rules, long-term commitments. CNA senior correspondent Melissa Goh got insight on the priorities of the Trump administration in a wide-ranging conversation with U.S. Ambassador to ASEAN, Kevin Kim. Now, he outlined Washington's approach to trade, the South China Sea, and other topics as well. Melissa began by asking him whether the latest tariff negotiations risk undermining trust between the U.S. and Asian nations.
I think the president wants fair and reciprocal terms. That is the driving ethos of what is underpinning our trade agenda. For too long, the United States, to paraphrase the president, we have lost on a lot of these trading terms. So we want to rebalance them to ensure that American manufacturing, to ensure that the goods that arrive into America do not use forced labor. The fact that the capacity in which they are used to provide these goods to the United States is produced upon fair terms.
You recently stated that the Code of Conduct should remain fundamentally a negotiation between China and ASEAN. How do you define U.S. role in this process?
We're not party to those negotiations. Fundamentally, we respect the fact that ASEAN will formulate its position based on consensus, which means that amongst the 11 member states, they will need to formulate and move forward with a common foundation. We respect the fact that ASEAN member states will continue to discuss with China on that front.
How far will the U.S. go in protecting its interests in the South China Sea?
South China Sea is a critical maritime domain in which the global economy depends on. Not just Southeast Asia, but U.S. allies in Northeast Asia, the United States. It links the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. So it's an important waterway for the United States as well. We will continue to uphold important international norms such as freedom of navigation, and we will continue to uphold our treaty obligations to the Philippines as well, and continue to provide security assistance and other forms of support so that our allies and partners in the region have the capacity and the will to defend its own interests as well.
If you had to name one concrete accomplishment during your tenure as U.S. Ambassador to ASEAN, what would it be?
What I want to accomplish during my tenure is to ensure that the U.S. cooperation with Southeast Asia is further deepened across all ranges of issues, whether that be on the diplomatic front, whether that be on the advancing the strategic application of foreign assistance, to highlight Secretary Rubio's recent announcement of $2.5 billion in strategic investments in Southeast Asia, and of course, deepening the people-to-people ties. I think the United States plays a stabilizing role in the region. Our presence, our diplomatic, economic, defense commitments and presence has been in Southeast Asia for decades. It is not a recent phenomenon by any means. We're with ASEAN 100%. That's going to be our posture. That has been our posture, is our posture, and will be our posture moving forward.
So South Korea has reportedly found discrepancies between final voter count and on-site tallies in its local elections in June. Yonhap News Agency, citing Election Commission data acquired by a lawmaker, says that gaps were found in more than half of all neighborhoods across the country, and that a difference of at least 100 people were reported in 29 areas, including in Seoul. The National Election Commission, or the NEC, insists that its hourly turnout updates are tentative figures and that discrepancies with actual voter count are inevitable. Now, the findings come amid a probe over ballot shortages during polling day that saw some voters turned away. The commission's chief resigned over the incident, and 2 officials have been charged with dereliction of duty. NEC headquarters was also reportedly raided last month to secure evidence. The opposition People Power Party is pushing for an expansion of the probe to include the 2025 presidential election and the 2024 parliamentary polls. Well, meantime, approval for the South Korean president reportedly falling to a new low, marking a fourth straight week of decline. Yonhap News Agency says that approval for Lee Jae-myung stands at 43.3%, down 2.6 from the previous week. Negative assessment of his performance rose to 53%, up 2.5 over the same period. And more than 2,500 people 18 and older were surveyed last week, with a margin of error of about 2 percentage points. Now, pollster Real Meter says that Mr. Lee's decline in popularity is driven by several factors, including a proposed property tax revision that's part of efforts to stabilize the housing market, as well as controversy over a bill revision to strip prosecutors of their authority to conduct direct investigations. Now, Shannon in China's southern Tibet is considered one of the region's cradles of civilization. It's also known for pulu, a traditional fabric woven from local sheep's wool and used for centuries. Today, one workshop is trying to keep that craft and the livelihoods built around it going.
At 80, Suring Yangchen is still working 5 days a week. She's been at this loom for 7 years. After relocating here from another country, she says work was hard to come by until she found this place. Suring is now one of more than 100 people working at this weaving cooperative in Shannan. Pasang started it in 2008. For him, it's about creating jobs, but also keeping an old craft alive. He learned to weave from his parents, and he says at one point, fewer than 10 people still knew how to make sutia, a finer form of pulu. It starts with picking the right wool.
我们当地的那个羊毛，我们当地的羊毛最细的那个，羊脖子上面呀，还是背上面的那些，精选出来的那些。
From there, it's spun into yarn and worked on traditional wooden looms. It's slow, hands-on work. And Pasang says the technique itself is a blend of traditions.
反正那个我们那个技术就是文成公主和我们藏族的那个布路融合在一起，就是出来了那个泽贴尔，刚才那个泽贴尔嘛，我们的那个品牌泽贴尔，就是汉族的文化和藏族的文化融合在一起出来的那个就是泽贴尔。刚才那个我们看见的那个布料，这个唐朝的事情，
Pulu weaving is now recognized as part of China's national intangible cultural heritage. But Pasang says keeping it alive comes down to something much simpler, getting more people to learn it.
我的梦想就是现在各方面政策呀各方面好嘛，那我的那个计划就是培养好多年轻人，一来说是传承下去，二来说是走向市场。市场的那些也是我的梦想，就是国际舞台呀。
For Suring, the craft brings a steady income. For Pasang, the hope is that it has a future. One thread at a time, they're keeping an old tradition from unraveling.
And that wraps up Monday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Thanks for watching. See you again tomorrow.